In recent years, the Council of Constantinople, held in 879 AD, has received much attention in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox dialogues, Eastern Orthodox apologists often calling it the Eighth Ecumenical Council. But is that historically accurate? In this video, we'll take a close look at Constantinople 879 to see whether it truly qualifies as an ecumenical council. Before we get started, we must distinguish two councils for the sake of clarity, as both are called Constantinople IV and the Eighth Ecumenical Council by different churches. These are the councils held in 869 AD and in 879 AD, 10 years apart. The Council of Constantinople 869 was held under the Patriarch Saint Ignatius of Constantinople, with the cooperation of Pope Hadrian II. This council deposed Patriarch Photius of Constantinople. The other Council of Constantinople is the Council of 879, which was held under the Patriarch Photius of Constantinople with the cooperation of Pope John VIII. This council restored Photius as Patriarch of Constantinople after Saint Ignatius had died and recommended Photius to be his successor. The Roman Catholic Church accepts the Council of 869 as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. Eastern Orthodox, or at least many Orthodox, accept 879 as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. This video will deal with the history of the Council of Constantinople in 879 under Photius, which is claimed by Eastern Orthodox to be an ecumenical council. It will not deal with the history of the Council of 869, which is accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. We will examine the Council of 879's immediate history within the first few centuries after it was convoked. For a larger historical analysis of its history in the East, that is, its status today as well, see my video on the Eastern reception of 879. This video will be more comprehensive. This council, sometimes called the Eighth Ecumenical Council by Eastern Orthodox, was held in the year 879 under Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, with the cooperation of the then Pope of Rome, John VIII, who sent legates to the Synod. This council has been weaponized by Eastern Orthodox to try and refute the Roman Catholic Church's beliefs and actions, such as adding the infamous word filioque to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed of 381. The primary reasons that Eastern Orthodox will invoke this council for is threefold. First, it is claimed that this council is an ecumenical council, which means that Roman Catholics cannot ignore its authority. Secondly, it condemned the filioque addition to the creed, although at the time the addition was rightly condemned as being an illicit addition made by the Franks without papal approval. Thus, this council is invoked by Eastern Orthodox as an authoritative witness against the filioque addition to the creed. Thirdly, it is claimed to have been accepted by Rome and specifically by Pope John VIII. Therefore, Roman Catholics will have a hard time rejecting the council's authority without making a contradiction between Pope John VIII and later popes. Now that the reasons for its usage by Eastern Orthodox have been mentioned, it is time to examine these claims in detail. At the heart of these three claims by Eastern Orthodox is the claim that Constantinople 879 is an ecumenical council. If this council is not an ecumenical council, then it becomes much easier to deny, overrule, and explain. Therefore, we will first examine this question. Was the Council of Constantinople 879 an ecumenical council? When we have completed our examination of this question, we will move on to the claim that Pope John VIII accepted this council. Note, the council's condemnation of the filioque addition will not be covered in this video. See my other video on this. We will now examine the Council of 879's immediate reception to see if it was accepted as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. We will not consider witnesses past the 13th century, since the council started gaining popularity among the Greeks only at that time, which is 4+ centuries later and after the schism with Rome. Our examination will consist of witnesses to the number of ecumenical councils before the 14th century. A final note before we cite authorities on this. It may be observed that when the following quotations speak of only 7 councils, they not only deny the ecumenical status of the Council of 879, but also reject the Roman Catholic claim that the Council of 869 constitutes an Eighth Ecumenical Council. This is important to observe because Eastern Orthodox who reply to the contents of this video might bring up this point. This is, however, conceded, since the Council of 869 was not formally accepted by Rome as an ecumenical council until Pope Gregory VII, which is in the late 11th century. Nonetheless, these quotes serve to demonstrate that Constantinople 879 was not admitted by the pre-schism church to be ecumenical, which is the point in contention. Our first witness to the status of this council is the very patriarch that presided over the council in a physical manner. This is Patriarch Photius of Constantinople. Patriarch Photius is an Eastern Orthodox saint, considered to be one of the three pillars of orthodoxy, who presided over the Synod of 879. It should be noted that there is no better early Eastern witness and authority that one could appeal to for an early understanding of the status of Constantinople 879 than the very one who presided over the same council and was the Patriarch of Constantinople and a representative of the East. Thus, Photius's testimony is very important, at least for the East. Now, the only problem with this is that Photius did not consider Constantinople 879 to be an ecumenical council. Before we deal with this claim from his writings, we must make a clarification and correction on a popular online edition of Photius's works. One should take care when reading the online edition of Photius's work called The Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit from the website Myriobiblos. In section 6 of this work on this website, you will see the language of Eighth Ecumenical Council contained in brackets. It should be noted, however, that these mentions of an Eighth Ecumenical Council do not appear in the actual text. This can be seen from scholarly works such as Joseph P. Farrell's translation, from which this is totally absent. The same is seen in Francis de Vornik's translation. So be careful with the online version. Photius never calls 879 an ecumenical council or the Eighth Ecumenical Council. This brings us to a last clarification in the same section of his work. Photius refers to the legates of Rome who attended Constantinople 879 and says that they, quote, were with us in the council of the Catholic Church of God, end quote. Now, some may try to argue that the words council of the Catholic Church means an ecumenical council, since Catholic means universal. So the phrase council of the Catholic Church translates to council of the universal church, which has to mean a universal council. This reasoning, however, is wrong for two reasons. First, because there are councils received by the universal church that are not said to be ecumenical councils. For instance, the Synod of Sardica, which is even called an ecumenical council by some saints and theologians, was received by the whole church through the Council of Trullo and Nicaea too. Thus, these are also examples of councils of the Catholic, that is, universal church, but they are not ecumenical councils in the strict sense. So the language from Photius is not sufficient to conclude that 879 is an ecumenical council. It should also be added that the term universal council, although not used by Photius, as Catholic scholar Hefele takes note of, historically had a wider usage of any council that represents a patriarchate without necessarily being seen as an ecumenical council. The second reason, which is the most convincing and purpose of invoking Photius in this video, is the fact that Photius himself believes there only to be 7 ecumenical councils. This both refutes the erroneous interpretation answered previously and also demonstrates that Constantinople 879 was not accepted as ecumenical by the East. Photius writes in section 5 of the Mystagogy that, quote, and the men who do not think in like manner the Catholic and Apostolic Church contemptuously refutes in the anathemas, for the second of the 7 holy and ecumenical synods declared that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, end quote. As can be seen, Photius limits himself to not 8 but to 7 ecumenical councils, when stating that the second of the 7 ecumenical councils allegedly refutes those who teach that the Spirit proceeds from the Son. Furthermore, it cannot be claimed that Photius wrote this work before 879 for the following reasons. In section 88, he explicitly mentions Pope John VIII's legates who were, quote, with us in the Council of the Catholic Church, end quote. In the same section, he mentions Pope Hadrian writing after that, referring to 879 and John VIII, but Pope Hadrian III only became Pope in 885 AD, which is 6 years after the Council of 879. Therefore, Photius, the one who presided over Constantinople 879 itself and the pillar of orthodoxy, did not consider 879 to be an ecumenical council, but only viewed the number in total as being 7. Turning our attention to additional Eastern witnesses, we shall cite the Metropolitan of Russia, John II, in the 11th century. To cite Dvořák, quote, "We are also in possession of 2 other official documents proving that the Byzantine Church of the 11th century did not number the Photian Council among the great ecumenical councils. The first is the letter written by the Russian Metropolitan John II to the antipope Clement III. This is interesting because it illustrates the Byzantine mentality of the period in matters concerning Rome." End quote. The letter of John to Clement reads as follows, quote, "All profess that there are 7 holy and ecumenical councils, and these are the 7 pillars of the faith of the divine word on which he erected his holy mansion, the Catholic and Ecumenical Church. These 7 venerable holy and ecumenical councils have been treated with equal respect by all the bishops and doctors of the See of Peter, the standard bearers of the holy and blessed apostles." End quote. As can be seen, John only speaks of 7 holy and ecumenical councils, and says that these 7 are the pillars of the faith. He is writing to the Pope, albeit an antipope at the time, and attempts to correct the Latins on all their errors. Yet he does not say there are 8 councils, nor invokes the supposed 8th council to correct the Latins on the addition to the creed. As Dvořák notes, this official document proves that the Byzantine Church of the 11th century did not number the Photian Council among the great ecumenical councils. Moving now from Eastern witnesses to Western witnesses, we will first examine Pope Marinus II. Pope Marinus II threatens to excommunicate disobedient clergy in the name of all the saints of the 7 ecumenical councils. Marinus, as can be seen, also limits himself to 7 councils, not 8. As Dvořák states, quote, "The passage is clear enough. Pope Marinus acknowledges no more than 7 ecumenical councils. Nor can there be any question of a slip, since the formula used by the Pope is couched in solemn terms and repeated twice, and Marinus had no special reason for omitting the 8th Council in this particular place if he believed in its ecumenicity. In similar terms does Marinus' successor, Pope St. Leo IX, a year before the so-called Great Schism, limit himself to 7 councils in his profession of faith to the Patriarch of Antioch. Pope Leo states, quote, "I accept entirely the 4 councils, and I venerate them as the 4 Gospels, because through 4 parts of the world the universal Church, upon these as on a square stone, has been founded. Equally I accept and venerate the 3 remaining councils. Whatever the above mentioned 7 holy and universal councils believe and praise, I also believe and praise, and whomever they declare anathema, I declare anathema." End quote. Pope Leo clearly says that there are 7 councils, but his most explicit denial of 879 as the 8th council is when he states that he accepts the 4 councils and then the remaining 3, not remaining 4. The quote is so explicit that Father Dvořák concludes that, quote, "the words leave no room for doubt. The truth is that Marinus II and Leo IX, in speaking of only 7 ecumenical councils, were true to the tradition of the Roman Church." End quote. Beyond the Western witness of these 2 popes against the status of 879 as ecumenical, there are 2 more documents of the same kind belonging to the period of Leo IX and his immediate successors, both endorsing the Pope's attestation of the number of councils as officially acknowledged in Rome, that is, as 7. The first of these witnesses is Leo IX's faithful associate, Cardinal Humbert. After the definite rupture with Michael Cerelius, Humbert pronounced excommunication in the name of the fathers of the 7 councils. For those unaware, in the Latin, septem is Latin for 7, so the excommunication is in the name of the 7 councils. Once again, this cardinal does not believe there to be 8 councils, but rather 7. The truth is that in quoting only 7 ecumenical councils, Humbert faithfully rendered the doctrine of his church, which at that time officially knew no more than 7 councils. On this point, Humbert was at one with his master Pope Leo IX. The other testimony is later than the cardinals by a few years, dating from the time of Nicholas II. This is St. Peter Damian. St. Peter Damian is a saint for the Roman Catholic Church, a doctor of the Church, and a cardinal. At the beginning of 1059, this pope sent Saint Peter Damian as a legate to Milan on a mission to reform immoral clergy, and Peter Damian duly reported on his mission to Hildebrand, then promoted Archdeacon of the Roman Church. Among the documents appended to this interesting report, we find a copy of the oath which Peter Damian administered to those clergy who wished to repent. The following is what we read in this formula with reference to the number of councils. I profess to hold the same faith as the 7 sacred councils have by evangelical authority decreed, and as the blessed Roman pontiff have explained to various people in their brilliant exposition of the truth. End quote. Once again, the number of councils accepted by the cardinal and clerics at the time is seen to be limited to 7, not to 8. Father Dvornik concludes, quote, "Here again Peter Damian and his companion Armsam bear witness to the fact that the Church of Rome in those days knew only 7 ecumenical councils, and therefore upheld the decision of John VIII, who suppressed the Council of 869–70. There lies the true solution of all these puzzles, a solution perfectly consistent and straightforward." End quote. At this stage, we need not continue with Western witnesses for the 12th and subsequent centuries, because by this time, the Council of 869 had received the status of the Eighth Ecumenical Council by popes and cardinals and canonists, thus rejecting the Photian Synod of 879 as the Eighth Council. As is manifestly evident, the popes before and after the schism, as well as the bishops and cardinals, have never considered 879 to be an ecumenical council. We will now return to the Eastern witnesses before and after the schism with Rome in 1054 AD. Attestations on Photius are not wholly lacking in the 9th and 10th centuries, but they are not as many as might be expected. We have now to consider the short treatise on the councils attributed to the Patriarch Euthymius. Father Dvornik writes of this patriarch, quote, "Euthymius's tract only mentions 7 ecumenical councils and merely designates the Photian council as the Union Synod." End quote. This demonstrates that he did not consider the Photian council to be the Eighth Ecumenical Council. However, the same patriarch does, to quote Dvornik again, quote, "give it the designation which the council itself had claimed of Holy and Ecumenical Synod, but it is not termed the Eighth, it merely remains the Union Synod." End quote. The fact that this patriarch calls the Photian Synod ecumenical does make his claim of there only being 7 councils much harder to interpret. It could be that he did not intend ecumenical council to be understood the same way the 7 ecumenical councils are understood, which Catholic scholar Hefele admits was sometimes the usage of the term ecumenical council. Father Dvornik seems to favor this interpretation, given that the patriarch, when writing about the ecumenical councils, only limits himself to 7 councils. Next must be made mention of Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos, who was a student of Photius and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Patriarch Nicholas made a profession of faith when he was elevated to the role of Patriarch of Constantinople. In this profession of faith, he professes to accept the decisions of the 7 ecumenical councils, and he names them each ending with Nicaea II. This shows that the Church of Constantinople still limited the number of ecumenical councils not to 8, but to 7 councils, thus excluding Constantinople 879 as ecumenical. In the words of Dvornik, Patriarch Nicholas clung to the old tradition of his church. An important mention must be made of Patriarch Michael I of Constantinople, who was the patriarch that ended up excommunicating Rome and starting the Great Schism. Patriarch Michael refers to the synod under Photius as, quote, "the holy and ecumenical synod presided over by Photius." End quote. Now, Father Dvornik does point out the fact that this work, known as the Panoplia, is disputed, so it could be the case that Michael is not the author of this work. Nonetheless, if Michael is the author of this work, then there are a further 2 responses that can be made. Firstly, as was cited by Hefele earlier, the term ecumenical synod did not always have the same usage as understood today. Thus, in calling this synod ecumenical, it is merely meant to denote that Constantinople 879 was an authoritative council that represented either Constantinople or perhaps the entire East. This is a probable interpretation given that Michael never refers to 879 as the Eighth Ecumenical Council or Eighth Council. However, this interpretation is not a hill to die on. So, if this interpretation seems implausible, then we can admit the second response, which is to concede that the Patriarch believes 879 to be an ecumenical council. However, this is an exceptional testimony and would be at odds with the earliest Patriarchs of Constantinople, such as Photius himself, and later Patriarchs as well, as we will show in a moment. Thus, this testimony would be a break in tradition. The next Patriarch to take into account is the 13th century Uniest Patriarch of Constantinople, John XI of Constantinople, also known as John Bekos, who gives an important witness to the mindset of the Eastern Church at the time. In his homilies, he makes mention of the synod summoned by Photius with Pope John VIII. He also writes that Photius summoned, quote, a great and all but ecumenical synod, explicitly denying the status of ecumenical for the Council of 879. Now, it might be objected that Bekos, being a uniate, did not want this council to be ecumenical, since it condemned the addition to the creed. The problem with this claim is twofold. Firstly, Bekos is seeking to convince his fellow Greeks of the truthfulness of the Filioque. Denying an ecumenical council, which the Greeks believe to be ecumenical, will not serve in accomplishing this aim. Secondly, Bekos was not in favor of the addition to the creed, only of the theology of the Filioque. Thus, this council's decision to condemn the addition to the creed was not a stumbling block for Bekos. The student of John Bekos, Archdeacon George, likewise designates the Photian Council as, quote, almost ecumenical, end quote, but it falls short. Dvornik writes about Bekos and George that, quote, the writings of these two champions of the cause of unity also corroborate the fact that in their days the Photian Council, for all its great reputation, was not classed among the ecumenical councils. Other writers discuss the ecumenical councils but leave Photius out. The Patriarch Gregory of Alexandria, for instance, who in the profession of faith he submitted to John, Patriarch of Constantinople, declared his acceptance of the 7 ecumenical councils. A very curious and important reference to the councils is to be found in a work by the Emperor Theodore II against the Latins and on the procession of the Holy Ghost, where the imperial writer provides his points with quotations from Holy Scripture and the Fathers, and maintains that all the councils approved the symbol as drawn up by the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, and firmly enumerates the 7 councils with few particulars on each. This work is also very important because the emperor is appealing to authorities for reciting the creed without the Filioque. The biggest authority he could appeal to would be an ecumenical council that directly condemned what the Catholic Church in the emperor's time had done, which would be to cite the Council of 879. However, the emperor limits himself to 7 rather than 8 councils, thus showing he did not accept 879 to be an ecumenical council. It would be tiresome to continue citing witnesses to the recurring amount of only 7 councils. Dvornik himself gives a few additional witnesses, such as the Patriarch Germanos II of Constantinople, Patriarch Arsenius I of Constantinople, etc. But at this stage, we will end our examination of the East. We will now consider the claims and arguments made by Eastern Orthodox about Pope John VIII, and then we will conclude our examination of this council. Now that we have covered the basic history of Constantinople 879's acceptance in the East and the West as not ecumenical, we will deal with Pope John VIII, the Pope who lived during the convocation of 879, and specifically with the claim by Eastern Orthodox that he accepted the Council of 879. The first question to ask is, did Pope John VIII accept the Council of 879 in any way? The answer to this is yes. We will cite 3 scholars and then John VIII himself. Firstly, Eastern Orthodox scholar A. Edward Sashensky states that the Pope gave his qualified assent to the Acts of 879. Now, Roman Catholic scholar Francis Dvornik writes that John VIII accepted everything done in the council regarding Photius' restoration, which includes his reinstatement without asking for forgiveness, the excommunication of those who would refuse to acknowledge Photius as Patriarch, and the annulling of the councils held against Photius in the 860s. Another renowned Catholic scholar, Father Richard Price, states that John VIII had formally approved the Acts of 879. Father Price gives the 2 epistles from which that is inferred in the footnote to his work. The 2 epistles, one to Photius and the other to Emperor Basil, is translated by Francis Dvornik below, although they do not differ that much in content and words. In John's letter to Photius, he states, quote, "We also approve what has been mercifully done in Constantinople by the synodal decree of your reinstatement, and if perchance at the same synod our legates have acted against apostolic instructions, neither do we approve their action, nor do we attribute any value to it." End quote. Again, in his letter to Emperor Basil, he says, quote, "We also approve what has been mercifully done in Constantinople by the synodal decree of the very reverend Patriarch Photius' reinstatement, and if perchance at the same synod our legates have acted against apostolic instructions, neither do we approve their action, nor do we attribute any value to it." End quote. It should be noted that nowhere in these quotes or in other documents does Pope John VIII ever call 879 ecumenical or the Eighth Ecumenical Council or the Eighth Council. All that he specifies to accept in his letters is the decision of 879 in restoring Photius as Patriarch of Constantinople. He explicitly states twice that any decisions of his legates in the Council of 879 against his instructions is to be ignored as void of authority. Evidence of John VIII accepting Constantinople 879 as an ecumenical council is entirely lacking in both his own works and in that of his successors, such as Pope Marinus II and Pope Leo IX, who also only accepted 7 councils. Therefore, John VIII did not accept 879 as ecumenical, but only as a local council dealing with discipline, namely, who should be Patriarch of Constantinople and healing the Photian Schism. We will now consider the arguments made by Eastern Orthodox that attempt to prove that John VIII accepted 879 as an ecumenical council. The strongest argument that John VIII accepted 879 as ecumenical goes like this. Pope John VIII accepted the Council of 879. However, Constantinople 879 calls itself an ecumenical council. Therefore, Pope John VIII approved of this council as an ecumenical council. Now, this argument assumes that since the Acts of 879 calls itself ecumenical, and the Pope approved of these acts, that the Pope thus approves of the acts calling itself ecumenical and therefore accepts 879 as ecumenical. Now, we will reply to this argument in 2 points. Firstly, Pope John VIII accepted the, quote, synodal decree of the very reverend Patriarch Photius' reinstatement, end quote, not the entire council and all of its decisions, as is clear from the fact that he further adds in his letters to Photius and the emperor that anything accomplished by his legates in the council against his instructions he neither approves of nor attributes any weight. Secondly, it does not follow that if a council is accepted in a general sense and that council calls itself ecumenical, that one therefore accepted that council as ecumenical. This can be seen with multiple preceding cases and popes and councils. For instance, the Seventh Ecumenical Council of 787, known as Nicaea II. Now, this council called itself ecumenical and was accepted by Pope Hadrian I and also John VIII. Yet, Rome, as admitted by scholars such as Father Richard Price, did not formally accept Nicaea II as ecumenical until 879 AD. This can also be seen from contemporary writers east and west, such as from the Vatican librarian Anastasius' letter in 783, which requests Pope John VIII to recognize Nicaea II as the Seventh Council. In the East, Saint Theodore the Studite, a saint both for Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, writing in 809 AD, explicitly states that Rome has not accepted Nicaea II as ecumenical but as local. Lastly, the speech of the papal legate at the Synod of 879, which states that the Roman Church now has, quote, judged it right to call it the seventh and to number it with the other 6 holy and ecumenical councils, just as these popes, namely Hadrian I and John VIII, all accepted Nicaea II, which called itself ecumenical. Yet these popes did not admit Nicaea II to be an ecumenical synod or the 7th Ecumenical Council, but rather a local council. So, likewise, Pope John VIII accepted the decisions of Constantinople 879 without accepting its claim to be an ecumenical council, but rather a local one. As an additional proof for this interpretation of John VIII may be added the testimony of Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, who also accepted the acts of the synod, yet did not believe it to be an ecumenical council despite its claim to be such in the acts. The fact is that no pope has ever formally accepted 879 to be an ecumenical council, as this video clearly shows. nor are there any persuasive arguments in favor of the Orthodox claim. Now that we have examined the testimonies, East and West, Metropolitan and Cardinal, Patriarch and Pope, clergy and emperors from the 9th through the 13th century, a clear conclusion emerges. The Council of Constantinople of 879, presided over by Patriarch Photius with the cooperation of Pope John XI, was not received as an ecumenical council in either the East or the West for roughly the first 4 centuries after its convocation, even though the council itself claimed ecumenical status. Most decisively, Patriarch Photius himself never counted the synod as ecumenical. He consistently restricted himself to 7 ecumenical councils, treating 879 as a local council. His successor and student, Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos, followed the same practice, likewise limiting the councils to 7. On the Roman side, Pope John XI gives no indication of accepting 879 as an ecumenical council. He confirmed only the reinstatement of Photius and explicitly rejected actions taken by his legates beyond their mandate. His successors, Pope Marinus II and Pope St. Leo IX, also restricted the number of ecumenical councils to 7, ending with Nicaea II. In the East, this pattern continues across Byzantium. Constantinople, Alexandria, and the wider Eastern world consistently enumerate 7 councils, not 8. This includes figures such as Gregory I of Alexandria, as well as the Emperor Theodore II, who likewise limited the ecumenical councils to 7. The same witness is also found outside Byzantium, including in Russia, where the numbers of council is likewise restricted to 7. The same witness to 7 councils continues among later Byzantium patriarchs. In Constantinople, Patriarch Germanus II and Patriarch Arsenius I and John Bekos all restrict the ecumenical councils to 7. Notably, Patriarch Bekos himself characterizes the synod summoned by Photius as an all-but ecumenical synod, a formulation that explicitly concedes that it did not attain full ecumenical standing. There are only 2 Eastern authors, Patriarch Euthymius and Patriarch Michael, who refer to the Photian Synod as ecumenical. Yet, given the historical elasticity of that term, it is not certain that they intended to elevate 879 to the rank of an Eighth Ecumenical Council, and, if they did, their position would stand in direct opposition to that of their predecessors, including Patriarch Photius himself and Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos, as well as the broader Eastern and Western tradition. In summary, the overwhelming weight of historical testimony, patristic, patriarchal, papal, and imperial, does not support the reception of Constantinople 879 as an ecumenical council. For centuries, both East and West consistently recognized only 7 ecumenical councils. Before closing, it's important to say this: the story of Constantinople 879 doesn't end here. In a future video, I'll be looking at the later and more complicated reception of 879 within the Eastern Orthodox Church, how its status develops over time among Orthodox councils, confessional texts, patriarchs, theologians, and saints. It's a history that's neither simple nor uniform, and it deserves more than quick summaries or slogans. So, if you are interested in seeing how 879 was interpreted, invoked, or sometimes sidelined in Orthodox tradition, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you do not miss the next installment.